why I march.
I march for myself. I march for my safety. And I march to be a voice for change.
I march for the millions of women and girls who live under the worst forms of dictatorship and tyranny. I march for those who are unable to freely exercise their constitutional and democratic rights to freedom and expression and choice. I march because I am tired of hearing officials make promises in meetings and at events only to see very little action taken to bring these promises to fruition. I march because it is time to let everyone know that the world is failing at advancing women's rights.
I march for the millions of women and human rights defenders who received death threats, who were sentenced to jail, and who are killed for challenging dictatorial regimes and speaking up against injustice.
I march because at the moment, my government, mi gobierno, my government, is legalizing and normalizing state-sponsored violence, policing of women's bodies, and the imprisonment of those who speak truth to power. I march because it is my human and democratic right to march.
I march because
Yo marcho porque marchar es mi derecho humano y democrático. Right to vote. I march because it is my human and democratic right to march.
Words of wisdom from the Flo Kennedy. If men could get pregnant, abortion would be a sacrament. Freedom is like taking a bath. You've got to do it every day. You've got to rattle your cage door. You've got to let them know that you're in there and that you want out. Make noise, cause trouble. You may not win right away, but you'll sure have a lot more fun. The biggest sin is sitting on your ass. And don't agonize, organize.
Prominent advocate for birth control, and it was her singular focus. She could sometimes be ruthless and sometimes ingenious, but she was someone who took action as opposed to somebody who really thought through deeply stuff. So she started the first birth control clinic. I can't remember if it was before or after that, when her husband, she was handing out birth control pamphlets. She had one that was censored at that newspaper that I pointed to, where she wrote a column because it talked about masturbation. And Comstock said they were going to close down the whole newspaper if they ran it. So they didn't run it. They ran a blank space. And this is The Woman Rebel. She was her newspaper, her magazine. And so she started the first birth control clinic, which was in Brooklyn. And you know where it is?
Where is it?
And they printed these signs in Italian and Hebrew, and it operated for about 2 or 3 days until she and her sister, who were running it together, got arrested. Her sister was convicted and sent to prison, and she went on a hunger strike. And Margaret Sanger actually called off the hunger strike without her sister's permission, and that was like the end of their relationship, basically. But they both felt very strongly about this. Then Margaret Sanger was put on trial, and she had already amassed a great group of people to support her, and Olga's going to read something from
Mrs. Sanger's trial began on January 29, 1917. 30 Brownsville mothers filled the courtroom laden with bags of bread and fruit, diapers, and infants. The remaining seats were filled by fashionable ladies from the Committee of 100. Mrs. Whitehurst of the police department testified that she found Mrs. Sanger in the clinic's back room holding a box of suppositories and a rubber birth control device. Condoms and douching solutions were introduced into evidence. Several Brownsville mothers testified about miscarriage, infant death, and hunger and disease. Mrs. Sanger readily admitted that she spoke to women about sexual physiology despite Section 1142. Their gratitude was touching, she said. Lawyer Goldstein met with the judges in chambers. He returned to report that he had worked out an agreement for a suspended sentence if Mrs. Sanger would promise not to violate the law again. Mrs. Sanger responded immediately. "I cannot promise to obey a law I do not respect," she declared. Spectators began clapping and shouting. Mrs. Sanger was promptly found guilty and sentenced to 30 days in the workhouse. From the far corner of the room, one word was uttered. "Shame," called out that voice.
So Margaret Sanger went on to found Planned Parenthood. She went on to get the funding for a birth control pill from Mrs. McCormick. But she also had some things in her legacy that have caused us to pause, and that is her participation in the eugenics movement in the 1930s. It was a little bit of a different movement than what we would think of today, but it still was not. It still was denying certain people rights based on some characteristic, and so that has caused a lot of reconsideration of her legacy, and that's a good thing. And Planned Parenthood, as you may know, has changed the name of its clinic from the Margaret Sanger Clinic now. But there also is this. I started out talking about Susan B. Anthony, and there's a Susan B. Anthony fund that's anti-abortion, and they use false information. In the same way, this information about Margaret Sanger has been twisted to be making an anti-abortion argument. Now, Margaret Sanger really wasn't even an advocate for abortion. She was an advocate for contraception, but even reached the Supreme Court, where Justice Clarence Thomas, in a most recent opinion, said that Margaret, in a dissent, fortunately, said that Margaret Sanger was a racist, and therefore birth control should be illegal, was basically the thrust of his argument. So we have to kind of try and figure out a way to find some nuance here. Like we can admit maybe that she was not a great person. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton also had some questionable racism in their history. So how can we accept what is good and powerful about what they did or gave us, and also acknowledge that they are not the people we wanted them to be? So anybody have any thoughts about that? Or
yeah, sometimes you have to separate things. The human being behind the fault of the human being that exists behind the movement and the things that they were fighting for, that were the things that we are still fighting for.
Yeah. I had a woman who joined the Walk from Japan and said that's something they're fighting there now, is laws making it illegal for people with disabilities to reproduce, essentially. So it's still an issue, but not something we would embrace today.
I don't know if you can for me, I don't think they're separable. I don't think you can separate these reproductive rights or the movement for people at all. Like they're intertwined,
Okay.
That doesn't mean that you can't separate the individual, as Lucy said, from the movement. Right? Obviously you should. or that you can't separate the contributions they make. I don't know. I don't believe in separating them. I think it's like
Why
all part
don't
of
you
the same
introduce
story.
yourself?
I'm Rebecca.
And you're Rebecca.
I'm a social justice nurse.
Okay,
too. Yeah.
great. Well, we love that. We love to just dissect this. Do you think that birth control should be illegal because Margaret Sanger? Okay, so you separate something.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the birth control is tested in Puerto Rico without full, and in the U.S. I know people who were injured by it, you know, without full information or consent. So and now it's, you know, about 1/10 maybe the potency was then. So do you reject
Yeah, maybe
birth
it's just
control?
a word choice question. You know, what does separate mean? You know, it's like in this context where we are now, and like looking into the history, we don't separate them because like they're intertwined. But if you're going to, you know, to Congress, it's kind of ridiculous to like debate about the eugenics movement when you're talking about birth control in this moment. On, you know, like we're not debating eugenics right now. We're debating reproductive rights. So in this moment, mixing them all up together is just total nonsense.
Okay, that's one way of looking at it. But, you know, there are a lot of eugenic elements in the anti-abortion movement. Do you agree? She's studying it. Yes. So
If you want to talk about eugenics, talk about anti-choice people, right?
yeah. What?
Sorry, there's eugenic elements in the anti-abortion movement.
Yes.
I mean, you know a lot about this. Yeah, I mean, anyway. I was going to say something else, but if you want to talk about that.
Well, there's just like the black genocide myth is like really prevalent now in the anti-abortion movement, which is that like black people are more likely to be killed by abortion than like anything else. You know, it's like these things are twisted around, and there's like the reason behind that is like based in history because you know black people have had their reproductive health, you know, their rights denied, have been sterilized, you know, forcibly sterilized, like. These were like eugenic, being tested on. These were like eugenic campaigns that targeted women of color, and that's real. So then it's like that history has to be acknowledged. It has to be like recognized that was part of this movement. But then we also have to not allow the anti-abortion movement to take that real history and turn it into then, you know, denying reproductive access to everybody today because of that racist history. So I think there has to be both an acknowledgement and combating these anti-abortion forces.
And there, you know, there are a lot of sterilization issues related to Latin Americans.
I mean, in the detention camps last year, the forced hysterectomies, mass forced hysterectomies were coming out. And I think we can say it's like, for example, take someone like Margaret Sanger. Actually, her racism was a detriment to the reproductive health care that she was advocating for, because of course, it's part of people's reproductive rights to choose whether or not to have children. It's not just about not having children, right? And the children that we do have, to raise them safely in communities that are nourishing. And of course, racism is, you know, that's not a healthy community or a safe community to raise your child if you do want to have children.
Perfect. I like that. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I mean, I'm going to agree. You know, I was just clarifying when we're talking about history, I don't think we can separate them.
Yeah.
But when we're talking, if you're in the legislative floor, like I said, then you should separate them, which obviously the anti-choice movement is not doing. Right? They're connecting the two things in the current, present, modern day, right? And using them super cynically. Against everybody. Yeah, that's just what the right does. Is it accuse people of the thing that they're doing, right? Right, exactly. It's like, obviously, we're the ones who are eugenicists now. Yeah. But we're going to accuse somebody at the height of eugenics movement. Yeah. Well, and Clarence Thomas uses this as an argument on the Supreme Court, where he uses a eugenic argument to deny reproductive health care. Right.
And he's going to be in the majority in the next case. So, you know, and so just to say, Planned Parenthood has been making amends for a long time. Faye Waddington became the first African American leader of a reproductive health organization in 1970 or something like that. And in New York was really the birth of the, I wouldn't say the birth, but Planned Parenthood hosted the first event that announced the reproductive justice movement. So this is an article I wrote in 2001 where the Sister Song and other groups announced reproductive justice as their new concept. And that was at a Planned Parenthood facility. And this thing on the back is something that, goes back to like the 1990s. So it's a long road. I mean, and it's a hard road because African American women, as we talked about with medical racism, have been treated badly. They also are the demographic most likely to use abortion. So, how do we protect them, protect people, make services accessible, and make sure that they have all the knowledge and decision-making tools that they need. We probably won't solve it here, but it's a good conversation.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings, irrespective of race, color, sex, are born with the equal right to share at the table of life. That to secure this right, there must be established among men economic, social, and political freedom. We hold further that government exists but to maintain special privilege and property rights, that it coerces man into submission and therefore robs him of dignity, self-respect, and life. Woman is being reared as a sex commodity, and yet she is kept in absolute ignorance of the meaning and importance of sex. Everything dealing with that subject is suppressed, and persons who attempt to bring light into this terrible darkness are persecuted and thrown into prison. We, therefore, the liberty-loving men and women, realizing the great injustice and brutality of this state of affairs, earnestly and boldly do hereby declare that each and every individual is and ought to be free to own himself and to enjoy the full fruit of his labor. That each and every individual has the unquestionable and unabridgable right of free and voluntary association with other equally sovereign individuals for economic, political, social, and all other purposes. And that to achieve this end, man must emancipate himself from the sacredness of property, the respect of man-made law, the fear of the church, the cowardice of public opinion, the stupid arrogance of national, racial, religious, and sex superiority, and from the narrow, puritanical conception of human life.
Fight.
Feminism.
Oh, I have to take this.
Shout it out, maybe.
End of secrets.
Freedom.
Perseverance.
Organize. Prevail. How about you, Lucy?
Strength.
All right, thank you guys.
Great term.
Thank you.